You're tuned in to Women in America, the podcast that dives deep into the issues shaping gender equality in the U.S. and beyond. Hosted by Pari and Eve, public health professionals by day, content creators by passion, we bring you expert insights, compelling stories, and actionable strategies to push the fight for equality forward. In our first few episodes, we're talking about rights at a crossroads, unpacking the intersections of reproductive rights and gender justice in today's America. In our premiere episode, we're laying the groundwork for a conversation that touches every aspect of gender equality. You guessed it, it's abortion rights. Why is the fight for reproductive autonomy central to achieving true equality for women and marginalized genders? And how do restrictions on abortion ripple out to impact lives in deeply personal and systemic ways? Pari and I share our stories, our motivations, and the origin of Gemma Talks, plus we'll explore how interconnected reproductive rights are to economic, social, and cultural freedoms. Let's dive in.
Why now? Why are we doing this?
Well, you and I started the social media channels like 2 years ago, right? So we've already been speaking in public spaces on the internets for 2 years, but it's been almost entirely short form videos. And I feel like we have so much more that we talk about on the back end that goes into planning those videos. This seemed like the right time to kind of let people see how things are made. What's that phrase?
How the sausage gets made?
Yes. How the sausage gets made. And also create more of a community among people who support us and for ourselves where we can talk about like the more technical topics that we can't always get to in our social media content.
Yeah, I think the beauty of it is that we're no longer limited to 90 seconds, right? And so
Thank God.
Unfortunately, we are dealing with such complex and nuanced issues that sometimes you do need more time than that. So
yeah. Do you want to take people through our journey? Maybe we start there.
Sure, yeah.
From inception.
Even I met, I think 11 years ago, and we have both been working in the field of sexual and reproductive health for about 15 years each, and have been friends for, like I said, 11 years. And then 2 years ago, when Roe fell, although 2.5 years ago, actually now, we were, experiencing all of the anger and the frustration and the sadness that I'm sure a lot of you also were. We realized that we wanted to do something more than what we had been doing up until that point. And up until that point, we'd been working in the field, but as part of our professional careers, doing advocacy, doing evaluation, service delivery, and we just realized that, we have a lot of privilege through our expertise and our access to resources that other people don't. And so maybe part of the role that we could play in this whole ecosystem is to try and translate all of this expertise into more digestible information for a lay audience. So as the true public health professionals that we are, we started with a needs assessment because why wouldn't we bring research?
We sure did.
And we did a whole landscape analysis of the education around not just abortion, but also reproductive health issues. And we found what I'm sure many of you know to be true, which is that the majority of the voices who were talking about these topics were not at all credentialed. They didn't have degrees, they didn't have education, they frankly didn't even know. They were using a lot of Catholicism or conservatism to make arguments about things that are completely separate from religion. And so
they were doctors, and doctors have a clinical perspective, which is very valid and valued, but is different than a public health perspective. Don't want to forget the providers.
For sure. Yeah. Providers are incredible. The thing about a public health lens, right, is that it's like a population-wide approach versus providers are doing an individual approach. And you need both, but we just thought that there was a dearth of public health voices that were talking about it. And so I had been kind of ruminating on the idea. And frankly, neither of us were on TikTok before that. And TikTok was also semi-new to at least in terms of health education. TikTok had been around during the pandemic, but people were not necessarily using it previously for health education. But yeah, and then even I were on a vacation in Ecuador, which we
the girlies do.
Which were both we need to get the hell out of this country for a little while and recover. And we were actually en route to the Galapagos Islands, so this super remote part of the world. And our flight was an entirely woman crew. both pilots were women, all the stewardesses were women. And I just remember being hit with this feeling of like, and I know it was in the moment, but it was just like, wow, we are, the US loves to talk about ourselves as like the most developed, the most free, the most equitable. And yet we are on our way to the Galapagos Islands, and this is like an all-woman crew taking care of us. So we did the thing where we like walked into the cockpit, or that day was the vag pit, really. And we asked them for a photo and then went back to our seats and we're like, you know what, we need to do something. And so that was kind of when we like really said yes to social media and launched our accounts.
We should share that picture.
Yeah.
We should share that. I forgot about that picture. We should share that on our Instagram.
Yeah. And it was actually kind of fun. They were like sanitizing the plane also while we were getting on. So I have this vivid memory because they were like using, I don't know what it was, hydrogen or nitrogen or something, but it basically looked like we had walked onto like this plane that was like in the clouds, because there was this just like plumes of like,
because this was just barely post-COVID time. So they were like disinfecting the plane through like aerosol.
Yeah. So it looked like someone had got a smoke machine and the cockpit doors opened and this like plume of smoke came out. And then we just see these two women sitting in these chairs. It was very funny, actually. So that was kind of how it began. And if you've been following us from the beginning, you know that our content has slightly evolved since then. Initially we were like really focused almost entirely and solely on abortion and reproductive rights. We still make that our primary care area, but we've definitely, I would say, expanded more into like just gender equality. And now we highlight a lot of how gender is actually part of pretty much every aspect of life, which ironically is what men criticize us for half the time, when they're like, why does gender have to be part of it? And I'm like, you literally don't get it, but that's why.
Because you have to ask that question, gender. If you weren't asking that question, we wouldn't have to address gender, but
yeah. And our friends and partners kind of joke that like we are a bit masochistic in this journey, because like our day jobs, our professional interests, our personal interests, our hobbies, the things that we do for fun are all just somehow related to women's reproductive autonomy. But for both of us, I think we decided pretty early on that this was an issue that we would care about forever. Like, Eve, do you remember when you have that sort of aha moment for yourself?
Yeah, I have two. One was like, I was really young. I was 15 and I was volunteering as part of a church program that took me to a children's home in New Jersey. And I spent some time there, and there was a 5-year-old kid there who I found out later had lost his mother, or his mother could no longer care for him because she was HIV positive and couldn't afford to take care of her own medical condition as well as her son. And I really, at an early age, I think I said 15, could not believe that our healthcare system wasn't such that, a mother should be able to receive the care that she needs in order to also be able to take care of her kids. And so I entered the public health field more generally through the HIV advocacy research angle. And then I lived overseas for a couple of years in my early 20s, and I was supposed to be an English teacher in North Africa. And I was put in such a remote location that the village I was living in didn't really need English, because frankly, they never left the village. And so I had a really rough couple of months where I was kind of asking the community, mostly women, because since it was a Muslim country, the genders were really divided in that women's space was inside the home and the men's space was everywhere else outside, asking my neighbors what they needed, what they wanted in the community. And the women said that there's a gym in town, but it's only for men. So we have nowhere to work out. We want to be healthy. What do we do? I started teaching aerobics classes with like no fitness background. I think my mom had sent me some Jillian Michaels DVDs. But to go back to your question, what I found through this experience is, as these women who I was doing aerobics with started to get more comfortable with me, they started asking me questions about sexual health, reproductive health, and I learned that they were not taught at an early age what menstruation is. They were not taught at an early age that it's normal to get your period. They were not taught at an early age how to use tampons or use pads. And it really drove home to me how much I took for granted that I had comprehensive sex education since I was like 10 years old. and how that information had helped shape my life. And so it threw me headfirst into reproductive health as a career field because I wanted to make sure that all women everywhere had the same access to sexual and reproductive health information that I had from a young age.
Yeah.
What about you? Remind me how you got into this?
I don't feel like I had a moment. It was just like, I grew up in arguably the most religious country in the world where women definitively do not have equal opportunity. And even despite, not knowing any life that was different than that, by the age of like 10, 11, I was actively rebelling against that kind of an environment. And I imagine it had a lot to do with who my parents were in terms of like how they raised me, even though we were in this super conservative society. But, I was like, oh, my younger brother gets to do things that I don't get to do. And that there was like this sense of inherent unfairness that was built into that. And I could see that even as a 10-year-old, as an 11-year-old, and I think that started to set these like building blocks for what was coming next. And then we immigrated and then came to like the opposite environment, like North America, which is just like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what people consider to be like peak freedom. And yet somehow it was almost like I, over my teen years and over my 20s, just continued to see major inequities that existed, like across societal norms and like the way, even like through dating and stuff like that, all of these differences between like how men and women are allowed to be and what's considered acceptable and all of this stuff. And then I think when I hit my like early 20s and started working in the field of public health, I also, like you, started in HIV. So I went from tobacco cessation to HIV protections to then reproductive health. And when I found out about abortion, it was just like, oh, well, yeah, well, like, why would that even be a contentious issue, right? And then it was like weird to realize that that's not actually how other people think. But also it is because, even in the US, abortion was not contentious initially, and then all of a sudden it became contentious. And I don't know if people realize that. Like, it used to be this completely accepted issue. In fact, was even like a standard procedure at Catholic hospitals, all of this stuff. And it wasn't until segregation started to take place where the Catholic Church decided that if the general public is no longer motivated or fired up about racial issues, and like more people are starting to believe that slavery was wrong and that Black people should be equally deserving of rights. What a concept. They were like, oh, we need a different social issue that riles up the masses. And I'm putting like years and years of history into basically a very simple statement, but that is essentially what happened, is that the Catholic Church realized that they needed a new set of like social norms to mobilize people into the churches at a time where people were actually becoming less and less likely to attend church. And so they turned abortion into their next stand. And that's what I think is, as someone who isn't white, as someone who didn't grow up in that faith, I just sometimes look at it and I'm like, how do like modern Christians not understand that history? Like, it's not even that old. It's pretty recent history. And so my point is simply that over the course of my public health journey, I just realized that reproductive rights were kind of this amalgamation of like all these things I had been feeling about the way that girls and women are treated. And it just felt like, in addition to maybe, I don't know, climate change is like two things that I could be passionate about forever. Mm-hmm. And at least so far, I've been right, because it's been 15 years and I'm still like raging about this. So maybe even more so than before.
I haven't slowed down at all. And I know that we both had a moment post-election where we went dark. And I know people who follow our platforms noticed that, because we were talking earlier about how people were asking for our reactions to the election. And we were literally both having existential crisis at the same time, which I know you and I like to joke that we have our dark times at different moments throughout our friendship, so the other person can lift the one up that's having a hard time. But this was rough because we both went down at the same time. But then we both rose from the ashes at the same time and decided to double down on our activism, which is why, we recently launched the newsletter. Now we're doing this podcast. So it's been an interesting cycle. I want to comment on something you said about your upbringing and how it relates to our channels, because you made the point that you grew up in one of the most restrictive country for women in the world, and then you moved to what you acknowledge is presumably one of the most liberal countries for women in the world, and still saw that there was so much inequality here. And we get comments on our posts all the time that's like, if you don't like it here, why don't you move to X stereotypically restrictive country?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, I grew up there. I also know what that's like. And I'm talking about this gender equality issue from a personal place of having experienced it in both arenas and telling you that it's still awful here.
Yeah. But and that's the thing, I feel like people who are traveled or just well read don't say stuff like that. But
It's
yeah.
crazy how comfortable they are speaking about.
Yeah. But the irony is like, okay, I'm by no means am I calling them a pinnacle of anything, right? Like I very much acknowledge that they are so seriously lacking when it comes to women's rights. But one of the countries that I spent time in is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia follows two types of legal frameworks, right? One, which is like the actual country's legal framework, and then the religious law, which is upheld only by a certain portion of the population. But the irony is that in Saudi Arabia, abortion is legal. And so,
Wow.
obviously there's so much other stuff that they need to do eons better at. But the point is simply that it's almost foolish to compare like one context to another, because you can't do that. Like there's so many different factors that come in. There's different elements of it. Like I remember a year ago, Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, they compared the fact that Norway has put into place restrictions on gestational age, right? They said, oh, Norway does not allow abortions post 24 weeks. So, and they're like a super liberal country, so maybe we should do that. And it was like, yeah, Norway also has comprehensive childcare, massively like universal public healthcare access. They have contraceptive access that is free, public, mandated as part of insurance. They have sex education in schools. I'm not even doing a good job of explaining all of the things that they have in place, but like, I do not believe that there should be restrictions on women's access to care, but you cannot justify this other place having done it without also taking into account all of the other things they've done to create an environment where people don't even get to that state in the first place. And it's like, so, it like that kind of shit bothers me, especially because, 98% of the procedures that happen in the US are happening before 15 weeks. And people seem to just like not talk about that at all. Like, so anyway, my point is simply that looking at the US, when you and I are doing like advocacy on our account and demanding better, when people come in and be like, well, you should just go to whatever, Afghanistan or Iraq. Those are the usual ones we get. Or just because I have the color of my skin, I often get told to go back to India. And I'm like, you don't know anything about these places. Like, you truly don't understand the context even. Like, Afghanistan used to be, and Iran used to be so liberal. They were so progressive before, guess who? The United States went in and dismantled their entire economy, their society, their government. It's like, it's just an indication of how far our education system fails people. And yeah, also, can you tell I'm short of breath because of how pregnant I am as well?
So pregnant.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Oh my gosh, I have to say, I was like maybe more realistic than some people about this election, but I was definitely like, I had a moment where I think it was 3 weeks before the election where I was like, oh my God, am I going to birth a child into a world where there's a woman president in the US? Oh. And then I had like a really like nice, happy cry about it in the shower. And then on November 6th, I had a really bad cry about it in the shower. It's like, damn it. So
I have a lot of friends, at our stage of life who have young kids, 2-3-year-olds, and they got them all gassed up around Kamala, mostly the ones who have daughters, and for good reason. They were excited that their kids' formative years would be at a time where there was a woman president. One of my friends texted me the other day that her kid fell asleep singing the name Kamala Harris to herself, which was so sweet. But I say recently because she has not had the heart to tell her what happened because the kid's 3, so she doesn't know the election's over. She doesn't know. And I was kind of like, why don't you just let her live in blissful ignorance? She doesn't need to know until she's like 8 that Kamala was never president. Let's just continue the joy. We don't need to ruin it for everybody, for like the 3-year-old girls of the world.
Yeah, that's fair. I feel like I gotta give kudos to parents, honestly, because I feel like I had the privilege of being able to be in a daze and just processing my own feelings for like weeks. And I have been so impressed by creators who are parents online sharing like their journeys and their experiences while also trying to uplift their kids. And
crazy journey.
Yeah. And to be clear, it's not that she's a woman. It's what she represented as a candidate. And
how relatable her experience was for the women of America. That she has worked her ass off through the California state system, up to the federal system, up to vice president. And she's still getting told that she slept her way to the top. And she's still getting told that she's not qualified when she is objectively qualified if you put her and Trump's resumes next to each other. And
if you blinded their resumes, not a single company would hire him. Yeah. Like there's no shot.
And so like I would ask people listening to us or any women in America who can't relate to that, because we've all been through something like that where we were passed up for a promotion next to like a male candidate who had the same qualifications, or we were told that we had an attitude at work or this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, we saw publicly that Kamala Harris got all of these same criticisms. Hillary Clinton got all of these same criticisms, that people were concerned about the tone of her voice or all these things that had nothing to do with her policies.
Yeah. And I mean, there are a ton of things that the Democrats can do better and should do better. We've talked about this in several posts.
Yeah.
But to discount the impact that pure misogyny had in this election would be foolish, because we have seen time and time again how people's perspectives and perceptions of women influence the decisions they make. And unfortunately, even the decisions that other women are making. Mm-hmm. And it's been alarming to me how many posts we've seen post-election that are just people being like, well, I would never have voted for a woman, and it's like, regardless of who it was. And it's like, oh, okay, so we're actually like much, much further behind.
Yeah.
They're like,
because you are more comfortable voting for a man.
Right. And I'm just like, oh, not just a man, a rapist, felon, liar.
Sure. For this election. But do you remember I posted something last week that was like 30% of the voting bloc is this, but 98% of presidents have been white men. And all of these men got up in the comments and were like, well, I don't vote on gender. I don't vote. They were trying to come at me for saying that we vote on identity politics, when like voting for an older white man is the ultimate identity politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's inherently like that. Also, the fact that parties would pick candidates based on the fact that they were older white men is inherently
identity politics.
And the irony is that Kamala's campaign, while they did, there were things they could have done differently, they didn't run on identity politics this time.
She really didn't talk about being a Black woman or an Indian woman. I mean, often she brought up that she was a woman supporting women, but she really did not bring her racial identity into most conversations.
Yeah, and the hilarious part about it is that Trump's campaign was entirely run on identity politics. Like, I don't think people understand that, because he's a white man. But all he did was talk about how horrible people of color are, how horrible disabled people are, how horrible anyone that isn't a white, rich man is. Like, every single thing about his campaign, when you break it down, was actually about identity politics. Like, the entire thing that happened with Springfield, Ohio. I think it's amazing, and I say amazing in the most negative of ways, but it's really amazing how people are criticizing the campaign for being too progressive, too woke, too identity focused. And I'm like, none of that happened. Like, there are legitimate criticisms you could make. Those are not the legitimate criticisms, Yeah. And so it like reminds me a lot of when you and I started doing our Women in America series, where like, them making statements that are so easily verifiable, like so easily fact checkable. Like, I'm telling you that the US Department of Labor says that white women make 83 cents to the dollar compared to white men.
And their comment would be, Hari, you're wrong, period.
Right. And I'm just like,
no, period.
I'm just like, Jason, believe it or not, the Department of Labor knows more than you about
What was the first post we did? I think we responded with someone's first name, like Mark and Tom, and then it started trending because people were trying to look up.
Oh yeah, it was Shane and John, because these actual two assholes came in and they were just like, oh my God, you made a post talking about your experiences as a woman? No. Disagree.
Yeah.
Because I have never experienced that as a white man, this cannot possibly be true. But this is what I think is just mad. I mean, literally the statements we're making are like, oh, it is legal in 21 states for women to undergo a pelvic exam while they're under anesthesia without their consent. And people will be like, false. And I'm like, literally I don't mean to be this person, but just Google it. Like 1 second of Google and this would tell you. And this is been my struggle with processing the results of the election, is that I think I have like a mental illness that makes me think that presenting people with evidence and facts will make them change their minds. And turns out that's not true at all. So
I think that was true pre-MAGA.
The fact that lies got rebranded into alternative facts, the fact that like, I don't know, like Breitbart is now called an alternative news source. Like,
that is wild.
It has been a systematic chipping away at common sense, at education, at fact checking, at, just like verified information, to now the point we've reached where Trump said it himself. He could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and his followers would not care, because they do not care about truth, about morals. Like, it's just not there anymore. So I think the Women in America series resonated with the folks that it resonated with because of how ubiquitous it showed gender inequality to be. Mm-hmm. And ironically, it resonated with the anti-crowd because they were just like, no, 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 no. And yeah, it's comical to me when they're like, this is misinformation. I'm like, you couldn't define misinformation if it slapped you in the face. Like, truly.
My favorite part about that series was just recently, I don't know if you saw this on our TikTok account, we were tagged a couple of times in this guy who was trying to clap back at one of our earlier Women in America posts. And I think it was the one that included that pelvic exam comment. He was like, this is wrong because look at this newspaper article and it says that it's illegal. Bro, it is illegal because of the movement we started talking about this online and making people so upset about it that the state literally changed their law.
Yeah.
Look at the fucking date on that article.
We even posted about it, but this is what I'm saying. Like, they don't care. Like, facts don't matter. And that was obviously like a huge advocacy win for us, right? Like, much more impactful than we thought a post could ever really be. Mm-hmm. But I think that's part of like I don't want to speak for you, but at least for me, like, that's part of what has kept me going, I think, along of our content creation journey sometimes, when like shit hits the fan and I just kind of lose my mind about the fact that all of these people are batshit crazy sometimes, is that like, okay, we have actually seen like the impact that social media can have on real world policy. That particular policy was because we had like tens of thousands of people writing to senators about it. And it just speaks to, if people actually like came together to do sensible things, then the way that the power of social media could be harnessed would be so different than what it's being used for now. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I think that's part of our goal long term. So
I have to say, I hope no trolls are listening to this because I'm literally telling you how to push my buttons right now. But one comment that I can't stand that we get is, well, why don't you go do something about it? Why don't you go run for office? Okay, I see what you're doing with that. But one, I do work full time in the field, but I don't want to tell you that because I don't want you to come fucking find me. And two, social media is the new grassroots advocacy. It has been since the hashtag Me Too movement started. It has been since the BLM movement happened several summers ago. And it continues to be a movement building space. So we just talked about the pelvic exam one. You know that we were also a part of the movement to get providers to be more transparent about the pain of IUD insertions. 2 years ago, people were filming themselves going into exam rooms, showing the live reactions of how painful it was to get an IUD inserted, myself included. And the media attention that that sparked put so much pressure on the Centers for Disease Control that they updated their guidelines, something that they hadn't done in like 10 years, for providers doing IUD insertions. That started on social media. And so when people come into our comments, or I see other creators getting these comments about why are you just whining online, all that tells me is that they don't really understand what advocacy is in 2024.
I remember someone was like, well, why don't you go march about it? Because when I was in my youth, we marched on Washington, and I was like, yeah, this is part of that. Like, it's like
we get it from all angles.
I know, but there are 11 million views on this video, and people are writing to senators like this is part of advocacy, and like we are also going and marching and also going literally to the Capitol and talking directly to people. So I feel like Gen Z gets it more than others, but I think the more that social media starts to take shape and hold, depending on what happens with this TikTok ban, people will hopefully start to see it more. Because I mean, like, think about, we were talking about the election earlier. There's been all of these post-election analyses that have come out that are basically saying like digital media was one of the most influential tools that was used during this election. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that was almost entirely on the conservative side because of the machinery that they have invested in and put in place and so on and so forth. But to discount the value and impact of social media is to truly not understand the changes that have taken place in the world over the last 8 to 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, we can look this up because I can't remember off the top of my head and share it with listeners later. But I know that V from Under the Desk News just posted about this, that there's now analytics coming out around creators' impact on the election. We know some of the statistics from the collective impact of the 200 creators that attended the DNC in August. Do you remember? Like over 400 million views collectively?
Impressions, yeah, which is more than what traditional media would receive in an entire month. But I think that's in the moments of darkness. This is what hopefully is like the things that make us keep going on our advocacy journey. We know about the capacity that these platforms have to make a difference, despite the fact that you and I especially, we get suppressed almost on a weekly basis because of the things that we talk about. There is a power that exists within these systems that is only just starting to be tapped by folks. And, we are grateful not just for the fact that we were able to influence the pelvic exam policy, but also for the opportunities that being in the creator space has brought us. Because it is interesting, like, don't you think about how our degrees, our dissertation, our subject matter expertise, our professional careers have taken us to certain places. But then when we started doing content creation using that expertise, it took us into totally different spaces. And there's a need for this everywhere. So it's more about just like being able to expand and continue to like leverage opportunities to bring credentialed voices into more spaces. And I know for me, it's also just been kind of heartwarming to see like the community of support that we have had the privilege of being able to build. We get, I think, a lot of really hateful messages in our inboxes almost constantly, but occasionally there's like a supportive one in there, and it really kind of is like, okay, yes, this is why we're going to keep doing this. Or women will share their stories with us that they just don't feel comfortable telling anyone in their personal lives. And I think that there's such a power to that, because like really we are strangers to them, and yet they're trusting us with this super intimate moment in their life. And that's kind of what keeps me motivated at the times where I'm like, just fuck the rest of the shit.
So if anyone out there is listening to us, send us your positive messages if and when you feel so inclined. We try to read everything. We can't get through it all because our DMs on Instagram and TikTok are batshit. But we do read them, and that's what keeps us going.
Yeah.
So I think to come full circle, I mean, part of the reason that we started this podcast is that we see the need for continued advocacy in this field, and the second election of Donald Trump, I can't believe I'm saying this, now gives us even more reason to keep screaming from the rooftops about women's rights and what women and men in America can do to continue fighting this battle to equal rights in the U.S.
Thanks for kicking off this journey with us. Remember, reproductive rights don't stand alone. They are woven into the fabric of gender equality. Next time, we'll break down the post-Dobbs legal landscape from the experts of those on the front lines. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and let us know what you think. See you next time.